There is an imperative to put a price on pollution, and if there are costs associated with for average families, we will more than compensate those families for those costs.
In January, industry and companies will be taxed $20 per ton of carbon emissions, just to begin, which Ottawa admits will almost certainly then be passed on to you, the consumer. That means a jump at the gas pump and your heating bill. Other products will probably go up too. So to help cover those costs, that's where the rebate plan comes in. The feds anticipate collecting billions on the carbon tax. They say 90% will go directly back to consumers, 10% to small businesses, schools, and hospitals.
Our province asks, if this is the case, what's the point?
It's basic economics that if you start putting a price on something you don't want, people will look at ways of not having to pay that price.
Prime Minister Julia Gillard today unveiled plans to introduce a fixed price on carbon emissions by June next year.
If you put a price on something, then people will use less of it.
Australia's announced plans to tax the carbon emissions of the nation's worst polluters. From next year, 500 companies will pay the equivalent of more than €17 per tonne of carbon. The country, which still relies heavily on cheap, locally mined coal for power generation, expects emissions to carry on rising as the export-led economic boom continues.
Overseas, and a leading group of international economists, historians and climate scientists is warning the Gillard government that an emissions trading scheme will be a mistake. The Hartwell Group says a similar scheme in Europe has done little more than give banks and hedge funds the chance to make more money. Europe correspondent Emma Alberici reports.
It's the world's oldest and biggest carbon market.
It's currently trading at about just under €13.5 a tonne.
The EU has capped emissions among 27 European countries. For everything above that, they pay for and trade carbon credits, the right to pollute. But experts say it's doing nothing to address climate change.
There's no credible evidence that it's had any effect in accelerating reductions in carbon dioxide in Europe.
Carbon emissions have come down in Europe, but economists say that's down to a deep recession that's cut production levels. The Hartwell Group of economists, historians and climate scientists are warning Australia that the EU's ETS market has crashed 3 times in 7 years and is prone to corruption.
Here at the European Parliament, there's a lot of talk about unity, but on this issue, the divisions between rich and poor member states is stark. Germany and France have won exemptions for their high polluters, and in Italy they gave out so many free credits that big business in that country actually profited from the trading scheme without dropping emissions at all.
The Trudeau government has introduced a plan for a new carbon tax, essentially charging anyone who produces carbon, companies, factories, and the average fuel-buying consumer. Whether you're on the side of climate denial or climate change, one thing's for sure, we are polluting our planet, and for the longest time, there has been no direct economic or environmental cost to producing so much pollution. For example, if a company had a chance to buy a coal-burning furnace or a natural gas-burning furnace, despite natural gas producing far less actual carbon dioxide for every BTU of heat produced, if coal is even 1% cheaper per kilogram, the companies are incentivized on a simple cost basis to go with the coal-burning furnaces, even though they're about 4 to 5 times worse for the environment. This makes business sense, but it's completely asinine for the environment. Effectively, the goal of the carbon tax is pretty much any environmental fine or levy, is to push companies to choose a less polluting option when possible. So instead of dumping toxic byproducts into a lake for free, the company would face millions in fines, therefore incentivizing them to dispose of the toxic byproducts properly, even if it costs them money. as the penalty of not doing so will be far higher. This kind of business cost structure analysis is unfortunately at the heart of most corporate decision making. You may have heard about how insurance companies would rather just keep silent about a recall or a deadly product and just pay the insurance benefits and the lawsuits that result, rather than paying for the recall of the product. Of course, this happens many times throughout history, and it even happened up till GM ignition switch recall, where GM rather let people die in a fiery accident and simply pay the individual lawsuits and settlements as they come, than actually doing the right thing and issuing a recall to replace the simple, problematic ignitions. All because letting people die horrible deaths was more cost effective than issuing a recall. These companies let people die for a little bit of extra profit. And of course, it's not hard to see how companies will continue this mindset into polluting the environment, taking financial decisions that will pollute our planet for a little bit of financial gain. This is effectively the goal behind the carbon tax. However, again, it's just a goal. And as we know with most government policy, the outcome is always far different in reality than what they wish. Just like any other tax or value-added cost, it's almost always going to be passed on to the consumer. Any corporation in this country that earns $1 of revenue must pay GST on that revenue, regardless if they're making a profit or not. So since most companies don't like losing money, they will almost always tack this on at the end of your bill as the original cost of the product plus HST or GST. This helps reflect that it's not the company just jacking up the price, but rather it's the government's levy on their earnings. Just like GST, the carbon tax isn't based on the income tax system that takes into account companies' profitability, meaning, for example, if you're a small gas-operated metal workshop and you use large furnaces that melt and smelt metal, this tax will be levied on any fossil fuels you do burn, even if it's clean burning natural gas. And the government doesn't care if you break even or even make a profit. This is just an additional fixed cost added to the overhead of many businesses. Now, unless you're RBC, Bell Canada, or a dairy farmer, they surely won't have the profit margins to completely absorb the cost, and therefore will almost always be forced to pass on the cost to the subsequent business partners and eventually the consumer. And since this carbon tax money isn't going to be spent on making better batteries or renewable energy or investing in the power grid for a future of electric cars, it's just money going to the government's pocket and no real plan to use that money to help us get off of fossil fuels. So again, it's just a tax going straight to Ottawa. And for this reason, it's not really going to do much for the environment at all. If you've ever been to Costco and you've ever seen some of their small products with large, cumbersome packaging around it, usually meant as a method to deter theft, of course, if you ever bought this, you realize how wasteful this packaging is, and Costco is famous for this. So instead of investing in anti-theft sensors, it's just cheaper to produce oversized packaging and waste all that plastic and cardboard boxes instead. You see, something like this will be a perfect candidate for cutting down waste. Just like how if you go to the grocery store, you're charged 5 cents for a plastic bag. Of course, the 5 cents is more arbitrary rather than paying for the actual cost of the bag. It makes the average consumer more likely to bring a reusable bag instead of paying 5 cents for each bag every single time they go to the store. It's small nudges like this that kind of inflict a little bit of damage on your pocketbook, but help to push you towards more environmentally friendly choices. However, with the carbon tax, there's no real way to avoid it. Electricity, natural gas, and famously gasoline and diesel all have inelastic demand, meaning if the price doubles overnight, demand will pretty much stay the same. Because the alternative is to walk or take a bike to work, which unless you like pedaling through 6 inches of snow, or biking 22.8 kilometers each way to work, which is the average distance Canadians commute to work each day one way. In some estimates, experts say that gasoline needs to hit $3 or $4 a liter before most Canadians consider giving up their personal car. And most of the respondents said that they would have to leave their job if they couldn't drive. Also, the timing of this carbon tax couldn't have been worse. We're currently undergoing a new oil boom, where back in 2009, many consumers are forced to buy hybrids and small cars because of record high fuel prices. But the past few years of low oil prices have incentivized consumers to do the opposite. People are instead buying large vehicles like SUVs and pickup trucks like they're going out of fashion. In fact, the disinterest in small and efficient vehicles is so rampant that Ford Motor Company is currently riding out their entire fleet of sedans and small cars. That means the Focus, the Fiesta, the Taurus, which is a favorite amongst police stations in North America, all of which are getting the axe in 2019. And especially with the recent news of 14,000 job layoffs at GM, as they're simply scrapping all of their small cars and sedans as well. And for the past decade, the best-selling vehicle in North America continues to be a gas-guzzling F-150. Number 2 in line is a Dodge Ram pickup truck. The third, the Nissan Rogue. It's not till we get to the 5th vehicle on the list that we get down to a sedan, the Toyota Camry. Even if this carbon tax makes fuel more expensive, people seem just to not care. People are buying vehicles in the hopes of driving them for years, and if they're concerned with fuel prices, they would obviously buy a small car. But they're not. And I see hundreds of pickup drivers on the way to work who don't seem to care about spending $90 to fill up their pickup truck. Maybe if we put a special tax targeting low efficiency vehicles like SUVs and pickup trucks. But the problem is we already have this. The gas guzzler tax, which is effectively put on vehicles that consume more than 13 liters per 100 kilometers, has been in place for years. But this just pushed companies like Ford to produce far more efficient trucks with aluminum bodies and turbo boost engines. The 2018 Ford F-150 gets on average 12.3 liters per 100 kilometers. Even a 6.2 liter V8 Cadillac Escalade with a curb weight of 5,800 pounds, the same weight as 31 adult males, still gets around 11.9 liters per 100 kilometers. So even this extravagant luxury SUV is not fazed by our environmental taxes. Many environmentalists like to point to Europe and European countries which are actually planning to outlaw the sale of fuel-burning vehicles by 2040. As battery technology advances, we may someday see an oil-free future for most advanced economies. But right now, looking at France and their recent gas tax hike, which led to 3 days of violent protests in the city of Paris. Yeah, imagine people not wanting to go bankrupt just to fill up their gas tank. Maybe one day, fossil fuels may go the way of the horse and buggy. However, we're talking about today, the present, the reality. When you wake up tomorrow, me, you, and Trudeau's massive oil-burning security entourage will get into our fossil fuel-burning cars and be paying much more for it. Even if we took the bus, well, buses use fuel too. So even if it's more efficient, it'll just raise the cost of transit fare too. In fact, in Toronto, Canada's largest public transportation system, the TTC, is a complete joke. The system is at its breaking point. Delays lasting to hours, and there's constant maintenance and delays, pushing TTC ridership down to its lowest level in years. Canada also doesn't have a high-speed rail system like Europe and most Asian countries. We don't have cheap, efficient air travel. We don't even have decent places to ride our bikes for 6 months out of the year. It's cold, it's wet, and it's dangerous. There's ice everywhere. It's not exactly the best time to whip out your hoverboard and try to make it across 3 miles of black ice. Well, the question is, what if everyone just buys an electric car? Well, right now, the waiting list for full electric cars, meaning no combustion engine, no hybrid, no nothing like that, is really only available from Mitsubishi, Chevy, or Tesla. And most customers are still waiting months to receive their cars, most of which are built in the US with employees who got to work using gas-powered cars. And even when you do bring that car to Canada, if you live in Ontario, well, for most of my viewers, I don't really need to explain the disaster in the making that's our electric system. All of this assumes that you even have $50,000 to $100,000 to afford a Tesla, not to mention the extra thousands of dollars of government subsidies that you were given on top of that. And if you can even still afford this, higher fuel prices weren't really a concern for you anyways. Oh, if you're that random person who just is lucky enough to get to walk everywhere and doesn't need to take a bike or public transportation, well, all of your food and products in Amazon packages are moved around on what? Well, right, large diesel-powered trucks. The employees who work at your stores or offices probably got to work on a bus or a vehicle. Even if you get a CRA audit in the mail for not declaring 48 cents of interest income, that sweet government love was delivered on a gasoline-powered Canada Post car. Simply put, as consumers and as a civilization, even as the basic laws of physics, we do two things. We move and we interact, both of which takes energy. And nothing in this economy happens without fuel or energy being consumed in some way. If you switch off all the power in your house and sat in a cold, dark room and took a deep breath after a delicious vegan meal you biked home with, yeah, you're still producing carbon dioxide. So the carbon tax shouldn't just be seen as a tax on coal or fossil fuels or dirty oil-burning companies, but pretty much anything that is transported, grown, or in any way produced using fossil fuels, which for right now is pretty much everything. And that's how the government is taxing you, simply for doing anything, which is unavoidable, and there's no way to get around it for the foreseeable future. And it doesn't help that this carbon tax comes at a time when our energy industry and Alberta as a whole is being crippled by government bureaucracy and low oil prices, which only adds salt to the wounds of many Canadians, especially in Western Canada. The Trudeau carbon tax may have good intentions, but unfortunately, that's all it is. Good intentions with none of the outcomes we need.